Saturane's Letters, Letter 3 of Biographia Literaria. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. Biographia Literaria by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Saturane's Letters, Letter 3. Ratzeburg. No little fish thrown back again into the water, no fly unimprisoned from a child's hand, could more buoyantly enjoy its element than I this clean and peaceful house, with this lovely view of the town, groves, and lake of Ratzeburg, from the window at which I am writing. My spirits certainly, and my health, I fancied, were beginning to sink under the noise, dirt, and unwholesome air of our Hamburg hotel. I left it on Sunday, September 23rd, with a letter of introduction from the poet Klopstock to the Amtmann of Ratzeburg. The Amtmann received me with kindness, and introduced me to the worthy pastor, who agreed to board and lodge me for any length of time, not less than a month. The vehicle in which I took my place was considerably larger than an English stage-coach, to which it bore much the same proportion and rude resemblance that an elephant's ear does to the human. Its top was composed of naked boards of different colours, and seeming to have been parts of different wainscots. Instead of windows, there were leathern curtains with a little eye of glass in each. They perfectly answered the purpose of keeping out the prospect and letting in the cold. I could observe little, therefore, but the inns and farmhouses at which we stopped. They were all alike, except in size. One great room, like a barn, with a hay loft over it, the straw and hay dangling in tufts through the boards which formed the ceiling of the room, and the floor of the loft. From this room, which is paved like a street, sometimes one, sometimes two smaller ones, are enclosed at one end. These are commonly floored. In the large room, the cattle, pigs, poultry, men, women, and children live in amicable community. Yet there was an appearance of cleanliness and rustic comfort. One of these houses I measured. It was 100 feet in length. The apartments were taken off from one corner. Between these and the stalls there was a small interspace, and here the breadth was 48 feet, but 32 where the stalls were. Of course the stalls were on each side 8 feet in depth. The faces of the cows, etc., were turned towards the room, indeed they were in it, so that they had at least the comfort of seeing each other's faces. Stall feeding is universal in this part of Germany, a practice concerning which the agriculturist and the poet are likely to entertain opposite opinions, or at least to have very different feelings. The woodwork of these buildings on the outside is left unplastered, as in old houses among us, and being painted red and green, it cuts and tessellates the buildings very gaily. From within 3 miles of Hamburg almost to Mölln, which is 30 miles from it, the country, as far as I could see it, was a dead flat, only varied by woods. At Mölln it became more beautiful. I observed a small lake nearly surrounded with groves, and a palace in view belonging to the King of Great Britain, and inhabited by the Inspector of the Forests. We were nearly the same time in travelling the 35 miles from Hamburg to Ratzeburg, as we had been in going from London to Yarmouth, 126 miles. The lake of Ratzeburg runs from south to north, about 9 miles in length, and varying in breadth from 3 miles to half a mile. About a mile from the southernmost point, it is divided into two, of course, very unequal parts by an island, which, being connected by a bridge and a narrow slip of land with the one shore, and by another bridge of immense length with the other shore, forms a complete isthmus. On this island the town of Ratzeburg is built. The pastor's house of vicarage, together with the Amtmann's Amtsschreibers, and the church, stands near the summit of a hill, which slopes down to the slip of land and the little bridge, from which, through a superb military gate, you step into the island town of Ratzeburg. This again is itself a little hill, by ascending and descending which you arrive at the long bridge, and so to the other shore. The water to the south of the town is called the Little Lake, which however almost engrosses the beauties of the whole, the shores being just often enough green and bare to give the proper effect to the magnificent groves which occupy the greater part of their circumference. From the turnings, windings, and indentations of the shore, the views vary almost every 10 steps, and the whole has a sort of majestic beauty, a feminine grandeur. At the north of the great lake, and peeping over it, I see the 7 church towers of Lübeck, at the distance of 12 or 13 miles, yet as distinctly as if they were not 3. The only defect in the view is, that Ratzeburg is built entirely of red bricks, and all the houses roofed with red tiles. To the eye, therefore, it presents a clump of brick dust red. Yet this evening, October 10th, 20 minutes past 5, I saw the town perfectly beautiful, and the whole softened down into complete keeping, if I may borrow a term from the painters. The sky over Ratzeburg and all the east was a pure evening blue, while over the west it was covered with light sandy clouds. Hence a deep red light spread over the whole prospect, in undisturbed harmony with the red town, the brown red woods, and the yellow red reeds on the skirts of the lake. 2 or 3 boats, with single persons paddling them, floated up and down in the rich light, which not only was itself in harmony with all, but brought all into harmony. I should have told you that I went back to Hamburg on Thursday, September 27th, to take leave of my friend, who travelled southward, and returned hither on the Monday following. From Empfelde, a village half-way from Ratzeburg, I walked to Hamburg through deep sandy roads and a dreary flat, the soil everywhere white, hungry, and excessively pulverized. But the approach to the city is pleasing. Light, cool country houses, which you can look through and see the gardens behind them, with arbours and trellis work, and thick vegetable walls, and trees in cloisters and piazzas, each house with neat rails before it, and green seats within the rails. Every object, whether the growth of nature or the work of man, was neat and artificial. It pleased me far better than if the houses and gardens and pleasure fields had been in a nobler taste, for this nobler taste would have been mere apery. The busy, anxious, money-loving merchant of Hamburg could only have adopted, he could not have enjoyed the simplicity of nature. The mind begins to love nature by imitating human conveniences in nature, but this is a step in intellect, though a low one, and were it not so, yet all around me spoke of innocent enjoyment and sensitive comforts, and I entered with unscrupulous sympathy into the enjoyments and comforts even of the busy, anxious, money-loving merchants of Hamburg. In this charitable and Catholic mood I reached the vast ramparts of the city. These are huge green cushions, one rising above the other, with trees growing in the interspaces, pledges and symbols of a long peace. Of my return I have nothing worth communicating, except that I took extra post, which answers to posting in England. These North German post-chaises are uncovered wicker carts. An English dust-cart is a piece of finery, a chef-d'oeuvre of mechanism, compared with them and the horses. A savage might use their ribs instead of his fingers for a numeration table. Wherever we stopped, the postilion fed his cattle with the brown rye bread of which he eat himself, all breakfasting together. Only the horses had no gin to their water, and the postilion no water to his gin. Now and henceforward for subjects of more interest to you, and to the objects in search of which I left you, namely, the literati and literature of Germany. Believe me, I walked with an impression of awe on my spirits, as W and myself accompanied Mr. Klopstock to the house of his brother, the poet, which stands about 1/4 of a mile from the city gate. It is one of a row of little commonplace summer houses, for so they looked, with 4 or 5 rows of young meagre elm trees before the windows, beyond which is a green, and then a dead flat intersected with several roads. Whatever beauty, thought I, may be before the poet's eyes at present, it must certainly be purely of his own creation. We waited a few minutes in a neat little parlour, ornamented with the figures of 2 of the muses, and with prints, the subjects of which were from Klopstock's odes. The poet entered. I was much disappointed in his countenance, and recognised in it no likeness to the bust. There was no comprehension in the forehead, no weight over the eyebrows, no expression of peculiarity, moral or intellectual, on the eyes, no massiveness in the general countenance. He is, if anything, rather below the middle size. He wore very large half boots, which his legs filled, so fearfully were they swollen. However, though neither W nor myself could discover any indications of sublimity or enthusiasm in his physiognomy, we were both equally impressed with his liveliness and his kind and ready courtesy. He talked in French with my friend, and with difficulty spoke a few sentences to me in English. His enunciation was not in the least affected by the entire want of his upper teeth. The conversation began on his part by the expression of his rapture at the surrender of the detachment of French troops under General Humbert. Their proceedings in Ireland with regard to the committee which they had appointed, with the rest of their organizing system, seemed to have given the poet great entertainment. He then declared his sanguine belief in Nelson's victory, and anticipated its confirmation with a keen and triumphant pleasure. His words, tones, looks, implied the most vehement anti-Gallicanism. The subject changed to literature, and I inquired in Latin concerning the history of German poetry and the elder German poets. To my great astonishment he confessed that he knew very little on the subject. He had indeed occasionally read 1 or 2 of their elder writers, but not so as to enable him to speak of their merits. Professor Eberling, he said, would probably give me every information of this kind. The subject had not particularly excited his curiosity. He then talked of Milton and Glover, and thought Glover's blank verse superior to Milton's. W and myself expressed our surprise, and my friend gave his definition and notion of harmonious verse, that it consisted, the English iambic blank verse above all, in the apt arrangement of pauses and cadences, and the sweep of whole paragraphs, with many a winding bout of linked sweetness long drawn out, and not in the even flow, much less in the prominence of antithetic vigour of single lines, which were indeed injurious to the total effect, except where they were introduced for some specific purpose. Klopstock assented, and said that he meant to confine Glover's superiority to single lines. He told us that he had read Milton in a prose translation when he was 14. I understood him thus myself, and W. interpreted Klopstock's French as I had already construed it. He appeared to know very little of Milton, or indeed of our poets in general. He spoke with great indignation of the English prose translation of his Messiah. All the translations had been bad, very bad, but the English was no translation. There were pages on pages not in the original, and half the original was not to be found in the translation. W. told him that I intended to translate a few of his odes as specimens of German lyrics. He then said to me in English, "I wish you would render into English some select passages of the Messiah, and revenge me of your countrymen." It was the liveliest thing which he produced in the whole conversation. He told us that his first ode was 50 years older than his last. I looked at him with much emotion. I considered him as the venerable father of German poetry, as a good man, as a Christian, 74 years old, with legs enormously swollen, yet active, lively, cheerful, and kind and communicative. My eyes felt as if a tear was swelling into them. In the portrait of Lessing there was a toupee periwig, which enormously injured the effect of his physiognomy. Klopstock wore the same, powdered and frizzled. By the by, old men ought never to wear powder. The contrast between a large snow-white wig and the colour of an old man's skin is disgusting, and wrinkles in such a neighbourhood appear only channels for dirt. It is an honour to poets and great men that you think of them as parts of nature, and anything of trick and fashion wounds you in them, as much as when you see venerable ewes clipped into miserable peacocks. The author of the Messiah should have worn his own grey hair. His powder and periwig were to the eye what Mr. Virgil would be to the ear. Klopstock dwelt much on the superior power which the German language possessed of concentrating meaning. He said, he had often translated parts of Homer and Virgil line by line, and a German line proved always sufficient for a Greek or Latin one. In English you cannot do this. I answered that in English we could commonly render one Greek heroic line in a line and a half of our common heroic metre, and I conjectured that this line and a half would be found to contain no more syllables than one German or Greek hexameter. He did not understand me, and I, who wished to hear his opinions, not to correct them, was glad that he did not. We now took our leave. At the beginning of the French Revolution, Klopstock wrote odes of congratulation. He received some honorary presents from the French Republic, a golden crown, I believe, and like our Priestley was invited to a seat in the legislature, which he declined. But when French liberty metamorphosed herself into a fury, he sent back these presents with a palinodia, declaring his abhorrence of their proceedings, and since then he has been perhaps more than enough an anti-Gallican. I mean, that in his just contempt and detestation of the crimes and follies of the revolutionists, he suffers himself to forget that the revolution itself is a process of the divine providence, and that as the folly of men is the wisdom of God, so are their iniquities instruments of his goodness. From Klopstock's house we walked to the ramparts, discoursing together on the poet and his conversation, till our attention was diverted to the beauty and singularity of the sunset and its effects on the objects around us. There were woods in the distance. A rich sandy light, nay, of a much deeper colour than sandy, lay over these woods that blackened in the blaze. Over that part of the woods which lay immediately under the intenser light, a brassy mist floated. The trees on the ramparts, and the people moving to and fro between them, were cut or divided into equal segments of deep shade and brassy light. Had the trees and the bodies of the men and women been divided into equal segments by a rule or pair of compasses, the portions could not have been more regular. All else was obscure. It was a fairy scene, and to increase its romantic character, among the moving objects, thus divided into alternate shade and brightness, was a beautiful child, dressed with the elegant simplicity of an English child, riding on a stately goat, the saddle, bridle, and other accoutrements of which were in a high degree costly and splendid. Before I quit the subject of Hamburg, let me say, that I remained a day or two longer than I otherwise should have done, in order to be present at the feast of St. Michael, the patron saint of Hamburg, expecting to see the civic pomp of this commercial republic. I was, however, disappointed. There were no processions. 2 or 3 sermons were preached to 2 or 3 old women in 2 or 3 churches, and St. Michael and his patronage wished elsewhere by the higher classes, all places of entertainment, theatre, etc. being shut up on this day. In Hamburg there seems to be no religion at all. In Lübeck it is confined to the women. The men seem determined to be divorced from their wives in the other world, if they cannot in this. You will not easily conceive a more singular sight than is presented by the vast aisle of the principal church at Lübeck, seen from the organ loft. For being filled with female servants and persons in the same class of life, and all their caps having gold and silver cauls, it appears like a rich pavement of gold and silver. I will conclude this letter with the mere transcription of notes which my friend W. made of his conversations with Klopstock during the interviews that took place after my departure. On these I shall make but one remark at present, and that will appear a presumptuous one, namely, that Klopstock's remarks on the venerable sage of Königsberg are to my own knowledge injurious and mistaken, and so far is it from being true, that his system is now given up, that throughout the universities of Germany there is not a single professor who is not either a Kantian or a disciple of Fichte, whose system is built on the Kantian and presupposes its truth, or lastly, who, though an antagonist of Kant as to his theoretical work, has not embraced wholly or in part his moral system, and adopted part of his nomenclature. Klopstock having wished to see the Calvary of Cumberland, and asked what was thought of it in England, I went to Remnant's, the English bookseller, where I procured the Analytical Review, in which is contained the review of Cumberland's Calvary. I remembered to have read there some specimens of a blank verse translation of the Messiah. I had mentioned this to Klopstock, and he had a great desire to see them. I walked over to his house and put the book into his hands. On adverting to his own poem, he told me he began the Messiah when he was 17. He devoted 3 entire years to the plan without composing a single line. He was greatly at a loss in what manner to execute his work. There were no successful specimens of versification in the German language before this time. The first 3 cantos he wrote in a species of measured or numerous prose. This, though done with much labour and some success, was far from satisfying him. He had composed hexameters both Latin and Greek as a school exercise, and there had been also in the German language attempts in that style of versification. These were only of very moderate merit. One day he was struck with the idea of what could be done in this way. He kept his room a whole day, even went without his dinner, and found that in the evening he had written 23 hexameters, versifying a part of what he had before written in prose. From that time, pleased with his efforts, he composed no more in prose. To-day he informed me that he had finished his plan before he read Milton. He was enchanted to see an author who before him had trod the same path. This is a contradiction of what he said before. He did not wish to speak of his poem to any one till it was finished, but some of his friends who had seen what he had finished tormented him till he had consented to publish a few books in a journal. He was then, I believe, very young, about 25. The rest was printed at different periods, 4 books at a time. The reception given to the first specimens was highly flattering. He was nearly 30 years in finishing the whole poem, but of these 30 years not more than 2 were employed in the composition. He only composed in favourable moments. Besides, he had other occupations. He values himself upon the plan of his odes, and accuses the modern lyrical writers of gross deficiency in this respect. I laid the same accusation against Horace. He would not hear of it, but waived the discussion. He called Rousseau's Ode to Fortune a moral dissertation in stanzas. I spoke of Dryden's St. Cecilia, but he did not seem familiar with our writers. He wished to know the distinctions between our dramatic and epic blank verse. He recommended me to read his Hermann before I read either the Messiah or the Odes. He flattered himself that some time or other his dramatic poems would be known in England. He had not heard of Cooper. He thought that Voss, in his translation of the Iliad, had done violence to the idiom of the Germans, and had sacrificed it to the Greeks, not remembering sufficiently that each language has its particular spirit and genius. He said Lessing was the first of their dramatic writers. I complained of Nathan as tedious. He said there was not enough of action in it, but that Lessing was the most chaste of their writers. He spoke favourably of Goethe, but said that his Sorrows of Werther was his best work, better than any of his dramas. He preferred the first written to the rest of Goethe's dramas. Schiller's Robbers he found so extravagant that he could not read it. I spoke of the scene of the setting sun. He did not know it. He said Schiller could not live. He thought Don Carlos the best of his dramas, but said that the plot was inextricable. It was evident he knew little of Schiller's works. Indeed, he said, he could not read them. Berger, he said, was a true poet and would live. That Schiller, on the contrary, must soon be forgotten. That he gave himself up to the imitation of Shakespeare, who often was extravagant, but that Schiller was 10,000 times more so. He spoke very slightingly of Kotzebue, as an immoral author in the first place, and next as deficient in power. At Vienna, said he, they are transported with him, but we do not reckon the people of Vienna either the wisest or the wittiest people of Germany. He said Wieland was a charming author, and a sovereign master of his own language, that in this respect Goethe could not be compared to him, nor indeed could anybody else. He said that his fault was to be fertile to exuberance. I told him the Oberon had just been translated into English. He asked me if I was not delighted with the poem. I answered that I thought the story began to flag about the 7th or 8th book, and observed that it was unworthy of a man of genius to make the interest of a long poem turn entirely upon animal gratification. He seemed at first disposed to excuse us by saying, that there are different subjects for poetry, and that poets are not willing to be restricted in their choice. I answered, that I thought the passion of love as well suited to the purposes of poetry as any other passion, but that it was a cheap way of pleasing to fix the attention of the reader through a long poem on the mere appetite. "Well, but," said he, "you see that such poems please everybody." I answered that it was the province of a great poet to raise people up to his own level, not to descend to theirs. He agreed and confessed that on no account whatsoever would he have written a work like the Oberon. He spoke in raptures of Wieland's style, and pointed out the passage where Retzier is delivered of her child as exquisitely beautiful. I said that I did not perceive any very striking passages, but that I made allowance for the imperfections of a translation. Of the thefts of Wieland, he said they were so exquisitely managed that the greatest writers might be proud to steal as he did. He considered the books and fables of old romance writers in the light of the ancient mythology as a sort of common property, from which a man was free to take whatever he could make a good use of. An Englishman had presented him with the Odes of Collins, which he had read with pleasure. He knew little or nothing of Gray, except his elegy written in a country churchyard. He complained of the fool in Lear, and observed that he seemed to give a terrible wildness to the distress. But still he complained. He asked whether it was not allowed that Pope had written rhyme poetry with more skill than any of our writers. I said I preferred Dryden, because his couplets had greater variety in their movement. He thought my reason a good one, but asked whether the rhyme of Pope were not more exact. This question I understood as applying to the final terminations, and observed to him that I believed it was the case, but that I thought it was easy to excuse some inaccuracy in the final sounds, if the general swop of the verse was superior. I told him that we were not so exact with regard to the final endings of the lines as the French. He did not seem to know that we made no distinction between masculine and feminine, i.e. single or double rhymes. At least he put inquiries to me on this subject. He seemed to think that no language could be so far formed as that it might not be enriched by idioms borrowed from another tongue. I said this was a very dangerous practice, and added that I thought Milton had often injured both his prose and verse by taking this liberty too frequently. I recommended to him the prose works of Dryden as models of pure and native English. I was treading upon tender ground, as I have reason to suppose that he has himself liberally indulged the practice. The same day I dined at Mr. Klopstock's, where I had the pleasure of a third interview with the poet. We talked principally about indifferent things. I asked him what he thought of Kant. He said that his reputation was much on the decline in Germany, that for his own part he was not surprised to find it so, as the works of Kant were to him utterly incomprehensible, that he had often been pestered by the Kantians, but was rarely in the practice of arguing with them. His custom was to produce the book, open it and point to a passage, and beg they would explain it. This they ordinarily attempted to do by substituting their own ideas. I do not want, I say, an explanation of your own ideas, but of the passage which is before us. In this way I generally bring the dispute to an immediate conclusion. He spoke of Wolff as the first metaphysician they had in Germany. Wolff had followers, but they could hardly be called a sect, and luckily, till the appearance of Kant about 15 years ago, Germany had not been pestered by any sect of philosophers whatsoever, but that each man had separately pursued his inquiries, uncontrolled by the dogmas of a master. Kant had appeared ambitious to be the founder of a sect, that he had succeeded, but that the Germans were now coming to their senses again. That Nicolai and Engel had in different ways contributed to disenchant the nation, but above all, the incomprehensibility of the philosopher and his philosophy. He seemed pleased to hear, that as yet Kant's doctrines had not met with many admirers in England. Did not doubt but that we had too much wisdom to be duped by a writer who set at defiance the common sense and common understandings of men. We talked of tragedy. He seemed to rate highly the power of exciting tears. I said that nothing was more easy than to deluge an audience, that it was done every day by the meanest writers. I must remind you, my friend, first, that these notes are not intended as specimens of Klopstock's intellectual power, or even colloquial prowess, to judge of which by an accidental conversation, and this with strangers, and those too foreigners, would be not only unreasonable, but calumnious. Secondly, I attribute little other interest to the remarks than what is derived from the celebrity of the person who made them. Lastly, if you ask me whether I have read the Messiah, and what I think of it, I answer, as yet the first 4 books only, and as to my opinion, the reasons of which hereafter, you may guess it from what I could not help muttering to myself when the good pastor this morning told me, that Klopstock was the German Milton, a very German Milton indeed. Heaven preserve you, and S.T. Coleridge. End of Letter 3. Chapter 23 of Biographia Literaria. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee, Biographia Literaria by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Chapter 23. Quid quod praefatione praemunierem libellum, qua conor omnem offendiculi ansam praesidere, neque quicquam adubito, quin ea candidis omnibus faciat satis, quid autem facias istis, qui vel ob ingenii pertinaciam sibi satisfieri nolint, vel stupidiores sint, quam ut satisfactionem intelligant. Nam quem ad modum Simonides dixit, Thessalos hebetiores esse, quam ut possint asse decipi, ita quosdam videa stupidiores, quam ut placari queant, ad haec, non mirum est invenire quod calumnietur, qui nihil aliud quaerit, nisi quod calumnietur. Erasmus ad Dorpium Theologum. In the Rifacimento of the Friend, I have inserted extracts from the Conciones ad Populum, printed, though scarcely published, in the year 1795, in the very heat and height of my anti-ministerial enthusiasm. These in proof that my principles of politics have sustained no change. In the present chapter I have annexed to my letters from Germany, with particular reference to that which contains a disquisition on the modern drama, a critique on the tragedy of Bertram, written within the last 12 months, in proof that I have been as falsely charged with any fickleness in my principles of taste. The letter was written to a friend, and the apparent abruptness with which it begins is owing to the omission of the introductory sentences. You remember, my dear Sir, that Mr. Whitbread, shortly before his death, proposed to the assembled subscribers of Drury Lane Theatre that the concern should be farmed to some responsible individual under certain conditions and limitations, and that his proposal was rejected, not without indignation, as subversive of the main object, for the attainment of which the enlightened and patriotic assemblage of philo-dramatists had been induced to risk their subscriptions. Now this object was avowed to be no less than the redemption of the British stage, not only from horses, dogs, elephants, and the like zoological rarities, but also from the more pernicious barbarisms and Kotzebuisms in morals and taste. Drury Lane was to be restored to its former classical renown. Shakespeare, Johnson, and Otway, with the expurgated muses of Vanbrugh, Congreve, and Wycherley, were to be re-inaugurated in their rightful dominion over British audiences, and the Herculean process was to commence by exterminating the speaking monsters imported from the banks of the Danube, compared with which their mute relations, the emigrants from Exeter 'Change and Polito, late Pidcock's show carts, were tame and inoffensive. Could an heroic project, at once so refined and so arduous, be consistently entrusted to, could its success be rationally expected from, a mercenary manager, at whose critical quarantine the Lucri Bonus Odor would conciliate a bill of health to the plague in person? No! As the work proposed, such must be the workmasters. Rank, fortune, liberal education, and, their natural accompaniments or consequences, critical discernment, delicate tact, disinterestedness, unsuspected morals, notorious patriotism, and tried Maecenaschip, these were the recommendations that influenced the votes of the proprietary subscribers of Drury Lane Theatre, these the motives that occasioned the election of its supreme committee of management. This circumstance alone would have excited a strong interest in the public mind, respecting the first production of the tragic muse which had been announced under such auspices, and had passed the ordeal of such judgments, and the tragedy, on which you have requested my judgment, was the work on which the great expectations, justified by so many causes, were doomed at length to settle. But before I enter on the examination of Bertram or the Castle of St. Aldobrand, I shall interpose a few words on the phrase German drama, which I hold to be altogether a misnomer. At the time of Lessing, the German stage, such as it was, appears to have been a flat and servile copy of the French. It was Lessing who first introduced the name and the works of Shakespeare to the admiration of the Germans, and I should not perhaps go too far if I add that it was Lessing who first proved to all thinking men, even to Shakespeare's own countrymen, the true nature of his apparent irregularities. These, he demonstrated, were deviations only from the accidents of the Greek tragedy, and from such accidents as hung a heavy weight on the wings of the Greek poets, and narrowed their flight within the limits of what we may call the heroic opera. He proved that, in all the essentials of art, no less than in the truth of nature, the plays of Shakespeare were incomparably more coincident with the principles of Aristotle than the productions of Corneille and Racine, notwithstanding the boasted regularity of the latter. Under these convictions were Lessing's own dramatic works composed. Their deficiency is in depth and imagination. Their excellence is in the construction of the plot, the good sense of the sentiments, the sobriety of the morals, and the high polish of the diction and dialogue. In short, his dramas are the very antipodes of all those which it has been the fashion of late years at once to abuse and enjoy under the name of the German drama. Of this latter, Schiller's Robbers was the earliest specimen, the first fruits of his youth, I had almost said of his boyhood, and as such the pledge and promise of no ordinary genius. Only as such did the maturer judgment of the author tolerate the play. During his whole life he expressed himself concerning this production with more than needful asperity, as a monster not less offensive to good taste than to sound morals; and in his latter years his indignation at the unwonted popularity of the Robbers seduced him into the contrary extremes, viz. a studied feebleness of interest, as far as the interest was to be derived from incidents and the excitement of curiosity, a diction elaborately metrical, the affectation of rhymes, and the pedantry of the chorus. But to understand the true character of the Robbers, and of the countless imitations which were its spawn, I must inform you, or at least call to your recollection, that about that time, and for some years before it, 3 of the most popular books in the German language were, the translations of Young's Night Thoughts, Harvey's Meditations, and Richardson's Clarissa Harlowe. Now we have only to combine the bloated style and peculiar rhythm of Harvey, which is poetic only on account of its utter unfitness for prose, and might as appropriately be called prosaic, from its utter unfitness for poetry. We have only, I repeat, to combine these Harveyisms with the strained thoughts, the figurative metaphysics and solemn epigrams of Young on the one hand, and with the loaded sensibility, the minute detail, the morbid consciousness of every thought and feeling in the whole flux and reflux of the mind, in short the self-involution and dream-like continuity of Richardson on the other hand, and then to add the horrific incidents and mysterious villains, geniuses of supernatural intellect, if you will take the author's words for it, but on a level with the meanest ruffians of the condemned cells, if we are to judge by their actions and contrivances, to add the ruined castles, the dungeons, the trapdoors, the skeletons, the flesh and blood ghosts, and the perpetual moonshine of a modern author, themselves the literary brood of the Castle of Otranto, the translations of which, with the imitations and improvements aforesaid, were about that time beginning to make as much noise in Germany, as their originals were making in England, and as the compound of these ingredients duly mixed, you will recognise the so-called German drama. The olla podrida thus cooked up was denounced by the best critics in Germany as the mere cramps of weakness and orgasms of a sickly imagination on the part of the author, and the lowest provocation of torpid feeling on that of the readers. The old blunder, however, concerning the irregularity and wildness of Shakespeare, in which the German did but echo the French, who again were but the echoes of our own critics, was still in vogue, and Shakespeare was quoted as authority for the most anti-Shakespearean drama. We have indeed 2 poets who wrote as one, near the age of Shakespeare, to whom, as the worst characteristic of their writings, the coryphaeus of the present drama may challenge the honour of being a poor relation or impoverished descendant. For if we would charitably consent to forget the comic humour, the wit, the felicities of style, in other words, all the poetry, and 9/10 of all the genius of Beaumont and Fletcher, that which would remain becomes a Kotzebue. The so-called German drama, therefore, is English in its origin, English in its materials, and English by re-adoption, until we can prove that Kotzebue, or any of the whole breed of Kotzebues, whether dramatists or romantic writers, or writers of romantic dramas, were ever admitted to any other shelf in the libraries of well-educated Germans than were occupied by their originals, and apes in their mother country, we should submit to carry our own brat on our own shoulders, or rather consider it as a lack-grace returned from transportation, with such improvements only in growth and manners as young transported convicts usually come home with. I know nothing that contributes more to a clearer insight into the true nature of any literary phenomenon than the comparison of it with some elder production, the likeness of which is striking, yet only apparent, while the difference is real. In the present case, this opportunity is furnished us by the old Spanish play, entitled Atheista Fulminato, formerly, and perhaps still, acted in the churches and monasteries of Spain, and which, under various names, Don Juan, the Libertine, etc., has had its day of favour in every country throughout Europe. A popularity so extensive, and of a work so grotesque and extravagant, claims and merits philosophical attention and investigation. The first point to be noticed is, that the play is throughout imaginative. Nothing of it belongs to the real world, but the names of the places and persons. The comic parts equally with the tragic, the living equally with the defunct characters, are creatures of the brain, as little amenable to the rules of ordinary probability as the Satan of Paradise Lost or the Caliban of the Tempest, and therefore to be understood and judged of as impersonated abstractions. Rank, fortune, wit, talent, acquired knowledge, and liberal accomplishments, with beauty of person, vigorous health, and constitutional hardihood, All these advantages, elevated by the habits and sympathies of noble birth and national character, are supposed to have combined in Don Juan, so as to give him the means of carrying into all its practical consequences the doctrine of a godless nature, as the sole ground and efficient cause not only of all things, events, and appearances, but likewise of all our thoughts, sensations, impulses, and actions. Obedience to nature is the only virtue, the gratification of the passions and appetites her only dictate, each individual self-will the sole organ through which nature utters her commands, and self-contradiction is the only wrong, for by the laws of spirit, in the right, is every individual character that acts in strict consistence with itself. That speculative opinions, however impious and daring they may be, are not always followed by correspondent conduct, is most true, as well as that they can scarcely in any instance be systematically realized on account of their unsuitableness to human nature and to the institutions of society. It can be hell only where it is all hell, and a separate world of devils is necessary for the existence of any one complete devil. But on the other hand, it is no less clear, nor, with the biography of Carrier and his fellow atheists before us, can it be denied without wilful blindness that the so-called system of nature, that is materialism, with the utter rejection of moral responsibility, of a present providence, and of both present and future retribution, may influence the characters and actions of individuals, and even of communities, to a degree that almost does away the distinction between men and devils, and will make the page of the future historian resemble the narration of a madman's dreams. It is not the wickedness of Don Juan, therefore, which constitutes the character an abstraction, and removes it from the rules of probability, but the rapid succession of the correspondent acts and incidents, his intellectual superiority, and the splendid accumulation of his gifts and desirable qualities, as coexistent with entire wickedness in one and the same person. But this likewise is the very circumstance which gives to this strange play its charm and universal interest. Don Juan is, from beginning to end, an intelligible character, as much so as the Satan of Milton. The poet asks only of the reader what, as a poet, he is privileged to ask, namely, that sort of negative faith in the existence of such a being, which we willingly give to productions professedly ideal, and a disposition to the same state of feeling, as that with which we contemplate the idealized figures of the Apollo Belvedere and the Farnese Hercules. What the Hercules is to the eye in corporeal strength, Don Juan is to the mind in strength of character. The ideal consists in the happy balance of the generic with the individual. The former makes the character representative and symbolical, therefore instructive, because mutatis mutandis it is applicable to whole classes of men. The latter gives it living interest, for nothing lives or is real but as definite and individual. To understand this completely, the reader need only recollect the specific state of his feelings, when, in looking at a picture of the historic, more properly of the poetic or heroic class, he objects to a particular figure as being too much of a portrait, and this interruption of his complacency he feels without the least reference to, or the least acquaintance with, any person in real life whom he might recognize in this figure. It is enough that such a figure is not ideal, and therefore not ideal because one of the two factors or elements of the ideal is in excess. A similar and more powerful objection he would feel towards a set of figures which were mere abstractions, like those of Cipriani, and what have been called Greek forms and faces, that is, outlines drawn according to a recipe. These again are not ideal, because in these the other element is in excess. Forma formans per formam formatam translucens is the definition and perfection of ideal art. This excellence is so happily achieved in the Don Juan, that it is capable of interesting without poetry, nay, even without words, as in our pantomime of that name. We see clearly how the character is formed, and the very extravagance of the incidents, and the superhuman entireness of Don Juan's agency prevents the wickedness from shocking our minds to any painful degree. We do not believe it enough for this effect, no, not even with that kind of temporary and negative belief or acquiescence which I have described above. Meantime, the qualities of his character are too desirable, too flattering to our pride and our wishes, not to make up on this side as much additional faith as was lost on the other. There is no danger, thinks the spectator or reader, of my becoming such a monster of iniquity as Don Juan. I never shall be an atheist. I shall never disallow all distinction between right and wrong. I have not the least inclination to be so outrageous a Jorcancer in my love affairs. But to possess such a power of captivating and enchanting the affections of the other sex, to be capable of inspiring in a charming and even a virtuous woman a love so deep and so entirely personal to me, that even my worst vices, if I were vicious, even my cruelty and perfidy, if I were cruel and perfidious, could not eradicate the passion, to be so loved for my own self that, even with a distinct knowledge of my character, she yet died to save me, This, sir, takes hold of two sides of our nature, the better and the worse. For the heroic disinterestedness to which love can transport a woman cannot be contemplated without an honourable emotion of reverence towards womanhood, and on the other hand, it is among the miseries, and abides in the dark groundwork of our nature, to crave an outward confirmation of that something within us which is our very self, that something not made up of our qualities and relations, but itself the supporter and substantial basis of all these. Love me, and not my qualities, may be a vicious and an insane wish, but it is not a wish wholly without a meaning. Without power, virtue would be insufficient and incapable of revealing its being. It would resemble the magic transformation of Tasso's heroine into a tree, in which she could only groan and bleed. Hence power is necessarily an object of our desire and of our admiration. But of all power, that of the mind is, on every account, the grand desideratum of human ambition. We shall be as gods in knowledge, was and must have been the first temptation, and the coexistence of great intellectual lordship with guilt has never been adequately represented without exciting the strongest interest, and for this reason, that in this bad and heterogeneous coordination we can contemplate the intellect of man more exclusively as a separate self-subsistence than in its proper state of subordination to his own conscience, or to the will of an infinitely superior being. This is the sacred charm of Shakespeare's male characters in general. They are all cast in the mould of Shakespeare's own gigantic intellect, and this is the open attraction of his Richard, Iago, Edmund, and others in particular. But again, of all intellectual power, that of superiority to the fear of the invisible world is the most dazzling. Its influence is abundantly proved by the one circumstance, that it can bribe us into a voluntary submission of our better knowledge, into suspension of all our judgment derived from constant experience, and enable us to peruse with the liveliest interest the wildest tales of ghosts, wizards, genii, and secret talismans. On this propensity, so deeply rooted in our nature, a specific dramatic probability may be raised by a true poet, if the whole of his work be in harmony, a dramatic probability sufficient for dramatic pleasure, even when the component characters and incidents border on impossibility. The poet does not require us to be awake and believe, he solicits us only to yield ourselves to a dream, and this too with our eyes open, and with our judgment perdu behind the curtain, ready to awaken us at the first motion of our will, and meantime only not to disbelieve. And in such a state of mind, who but must be impressed with the cool intrepidity of Don John on the appearance of his father's ghost? Ghost. Monster, behold these wounds. Don John. I do. They were well meant and well performed, I see. Ghost. Repent, repent of all thy villainies. My clamorous blood to heaven for vengeance cries. Heaven will pour out his judgments on you all. Hell gapes for you each fiend doth call, and hourly waits your unrepenting fall. You with eternal horrors they'll torment, except of all your crimes you suddenly repent. Ghost sings. Don John. Farewell, thou art a foolish ghost. Repent, quoth he. What could this mean? Our senses are all in a mist, sure. Don Antonio, one of Don Juan's reprobate companions. They are not, 'twas a ghost. Don Lopez, another reprobate. I ne'er believed those foolish tales before. Don John. Come, 'tis no matter. Let it be what it will, it must be natural. Don Antonio. And nature is unalterable in us too. Don John. 'Tis true. The nature of a ghost cannot change ours. Who also can deny a portion of sublimity to the tremendous consistency with which he stands out the last fearful trial, like a second Prometheus? Chorus of Devils. Statue Ghost. Will you not relent and feel remorse? Don John. Couldst thou bestow another heart on me, I might, but with this heart I have, I cannot. Don Lopez. These things are prodigious. Don Antonio. I have a sort of grudging to relent, but something holds me back. Don Lopez. If we could, 'tis now too late. I will not. Don Antonio. We defy thee. Ghost. Perish, ye impious wretches! Go, and find the punishments laid up in store for you. Thunder and lightning. Don Lopez and Don Antonio are swallowed up. Ghost to Don John. Behold, they are dreadful fates, and know that thy last moment's come. Don John. Think not to fright me, foolish ghost. I'll break your marble body in pieces, and pull down your horse. Thunder and lightning chorus of devils, etc. Don John. These things I see with wonder, but no fear. Were all the elements to be confounded, and shuffled all into their former chaos, were seas of sulphur flaming round about me, and all mankind roaring within those fires, I could not fear, or feel the least remorse. To the last instant I would dare thy power. Here I stand firm, and all thy threats contemn. Thy murderer, to the ghost of one whom he had murdered, stands here. Now do thy worst. He is swallowed up in a cloud of fire. In fine, the character of Don John consists in the union of everything desirable to human nature as means, and which therefore by the well-known law of association becomes at length desirable on their own account. On their own account, and in their own dignity, they are here displayed, as being employed to ends so unhuman, that in the effect they appear almost as means without an end. The ingredients too are mixed in the happiest proportion, so as to uphold and relieve each other, more especially in that constant interpoise of wit, gaiety, and social generosity, which prevents the criminal, even in his most atrocious moments, from sinking into the mere ruffian, as far at least as our imagination sits in judgment. Above all, the fine suffusion through the whole, with the characteristic manners and feelings of a highly bred gentleman, gives life to the drama. Thus, having invited the statue ghost of the governor, whom he had murdered, to supper, which invitation the marble ghost accepted by a nod of the head, Don John has prepared a banquet. Don John. Some wine, sirrah! Here's to Don Pedro's ghost. He should have been welcome. On Lopez. The rascal is afraid of you after death. One knocks hard at the door. Don John to the servant. Rise and do your duty. Servant. Oh, the devil! The devil! Marble ghost enters. Don John. Ha! 'Tis the ghost! Let's rise and receive him. Come, governor, you are welcome. Sit there. If we had thought you would have come, we would have stayed for you. Here, governor, your health. Friends, put it about. Here's excellent meat. Taste of this ragout. Come, I'll help you. Come eat, and let old quarrels be forgotten. The ghost threatens him with vengeance. Don John. We are too much confirmed. Curse on this dry discourse. Come, here's to your mistress. You had one when you were living, not forgetting your sweet sister. Devils enter. Don John. Are these some of your retinue? Devils, say you? I'm sorry I have no burnt brandy to treat 'em with. That's drink fit for devils, etc. Nor is the scene from which we quote interesting in dramatic probability alone. It is susceptible likewise of a sound moral, of a moral that has more than common claims on the notice of a too numerous class, who are ready to receive the qualities of gentlemanly courage and scrupulous honour, in all the recognised laws of honour, as the substitutes of virtue, instead of its ornaments. This, indeed, is the moral value of the play at large, and that which places it at a world's distance from the spirit of modern Jacobinism. The latter introduces to us clumsy copies of these showy instrumental qualities, in order to reconcile us to vice and want of principle, while the Atheista Fulminato presents an exquisite portraiture of the same qualities, in all their gloss and glow, but presents them for the sole purpose of displaying their hollowness, and in order to put us on our guard by demonstrating their utter indifference to vice and virtue, whenever these and the like accomplishments are contemplated for themselves alone. 18 years ago I observed, that the whole secret of the modern Jacobinical drama, which, and not the German, is its appropriate designation, and of all its popularity, consists in the confusion and subversion of the natural order of things in their causes and effects, namely in the excitement of surprise, by representing the qualities of liberality, refined feeling, and a nice sense of honour, those things rather which pass amongst us for such, in persons and in classes, where experience teaches us least to expect them, and by rewarding with all the sympathies which are the due of virtue, those criminals whom law, reason, and religion have excommunicated from our esteem. This of itself would lead me back to Bertram or the castle of St. Aldobrand, but in my own mind this tragedy was brought into connection with The Libertine, Shadwell's adaptation of the Atheista Fulminato to the English stage in the reign of Charles II, by the fact that our modern drama is taken, in the substance of it, from the first scene of the third act of The Libertine. But with what palpable superiority of judgment in the original! Earth and hell, men and spirits, are up in arms against Don John. The two former acts of the play have not only prepared us for the supernatural, but accustomed us to the prodigious. It is therefore neither more nor less than we anticipate when the captain exclaims, "In all the dangers I have been, such horrors I never knew, I am quite unmanned." And when the hermit says that he had beheld the ocean in wildest rage, yet ne'er before saw a storm so dreadful, such horrid flashes of lightning, and such claps of thunder were never in my remembrance. And Don John's burst of startling impiety is equally intelligible in its motive, as dramatic in its effect. But what is there to account for the prodigy of the tempest at Bertram's shipwreck? It is a mere supernatural effect, without even a hint of any supernatural agency, a prodigy, without any circumstance mentioned that is prodigious, and a miracle introduced without a ground, and ending without a result. Every event in every scene of the play might have taken place as well, if Bertram and his vessel had been driven in by a common hard gale, or from want of provisions. The first act would have indeed lost its greatest and most sonorous picture, a scene for the sake of a scene, without a word spoken. As such, therefore, a rarity without a precedent, we must take it, and be thankful. In the opinion of not a few, it was, in every sense of the word, the best scene in the play. I am quite certain it was the most innocent, and the steady, quiet uprightness of the flame of the wax candles, which the monks held over the roaring billows amid the storm of wind and rain, was really miraculous. The Sicilian sea coast, a convent of monks, night, a most portentous unearthly storm, a vessel is wrecked contrary to all human expectation, one man saves himself by his prodigious powers as a swimmer, aided by the peculiarity of his destination. Prior. All did perish. First Monk. Change, change those drenched weeds. Prior. I wist not of them. Every soul did perish. Enter Third Monk hastily. Third Monk. No, there was one did battle with the storm with callous desperate force. Full many times his life was won and lost, as though he recked not. No hand did aid him, and he aided none. Alone he breasted the broad wave. Alone that man was saved. Well, this man is led in by the monks, supposed dripping wet, and to very natural inquiries he either remains silent, or gives most brief and surly answers, and after 3 or 4 of these half-line courtesies, dashing off the monks who had saved him, he exclaims in the true sublimity of our modern misanthropic heroism, "Off! Ye are men, there's poison in your touch, but I must yield for this, what hath left me strengthless." So end the 3 first scenes. In the next, the castle of St. Aldobrand, we find the servants there equally frightened with this unearthly storm, though wherein it differed from other violent storms we are not told, except that Hugo informs us, page 9. Pietro. Hugo, well met! Does e'en thy age bear memory of so terrible a storm? Hugo. They have been frequent lately. Pietro. They are ever so in Sicily. Hugo. So it is said. But storms when I was young would still pass o'er like nature's fitful fevers, and rendered all more wholesome. Now their rage, sent thus unseasonable and profitless, speaks like the threats of heaven. A most perplexing theory of Sicilian storms is this of old Hugo, and what is very remarkable, not apparently founded on any great familiarity of his own with this troublesome article. For when Pietro asserts the ever more frequency of tempests in Sicily, the old man professes to know nothing more of the fact, but by hearsay. So it is said. But why he assumed this storm to be unseasonable, and on what he grounded his prophecy, for the storm is still in full fury, that it would be profitless, and without the physical powers common to all other violent sea winds in purifying the atmosphere, we are left in the dark, as well concerning the particular points in which he knew it, during its continuance, to differ from those that he had been acquainted with in his youth. We are at length introduced to the Lady Imogen, who we learn had not rested through the night, not on account of the tempest, for, long ere the storm arose, her restless gestures forbade all hope to see her blessed with sleep. Sitting at a table and looking at a portrait, she informs us, first, that portrait painters may make a portrait from memory. The limner's art may trace the absent feature, for surely these words could never mean that a painter may have a person sit to him who afterwards may leave the room or perhaps the country. Secondly, that a portrait painter can enable a mourning lady to possess a good likeness of her absent lover, but that the portrait painter cannot, and who shall, restore the scenes in which they met and parted. The natural answer would have been, why, the scene painter, to be sure. But this unreasonable lady requires in addition sundry things to be painted that have neither lines nor colours. The thoughts, the recollections, sweet and bitter, or the Elysian dreams of lovers when they loved, which last sentence must be supposed to mean when they were present and making love to each other. Then, if this portrait could speak, it would acquit the faith of womankind. How? Has she remained constant? No. She has been married to another man, whose wife she now is. How then? Why, that, in spite of her marriage vow, she had continued to yearn and crave for her former lover. This has her body, that her mind, which has the better bargain. The lover, however, was not contented with this precious arrangement, as we shall soon find. The lady proceeds to inform us that during the many years of their separation, there have happened in the different parts of the world a number of such things, even such as in a course of years always have, and till the millennium doubtless always will happen somewhere or other. Yet this passage, both in language and in metre, is perhaps amongst the best parts of the play. The lady's love companion and most esteemed attendant, Clotilda, now enters, and explains this love and esteem by proving herself a most passive and dispassionate listener, as well as a brief and lucky querist, who asks by chance questions that we should have thought made for the very sake of the answers. In short, she very much reminds us of those puppet heroines, for whom the showman contrives to dialogue without any skill in ventriloquism. This, notwithstanding, is the best scene in the play, and though crowded with solecisms, corrupt diction, and offences against metre, would possess merit sufficient to outweigh them, if we could suspend the moral sense during the perusal. It tells well and passionately the preliminary circumstances, and thus overcomes the main difficulty of most first acts, to wit, that of retrospective narration. It tells us of her having been honourably addressed by a noble youth, of rank and fortune vastly superior to her own, of their mutual love, heightened on her part by gratitude, of his loss of his sovereign's favour, his disgrace, attainder, and flight, that he, thus degraded, sank into a vile ruffian, the chieftain of a murderous banditti, and that from the habitual indulgence of the most reprobate habits and ferocious passions, he had become so changed, even in appearance and features, that she who bore him had recoiled from him, nor known the alien visage of her child, yet still she, Imogen, loved him. She is compelled by the silent entreaties of her father, perishing with bitter shameful want on the cold earth, to give her hand, with a heart thus irrecoverably pre-engaged, to Lord Aldobrand, the enemy of her lover, even to the very man who had baffled his ambitious schemes, and was, at the present time, entrusted with the execution of the sentence of death which had been passed on Bertram. Now, the proof of woman's love, so industriously held forth for the sympathy, if not for the esteem of the audience, consists in this, that, though Bertram had become a robber and a murderer by trade, a ruffian in manners, yea, with form and features at which his own mother could not but recoil, yet she, Lady Imogen, the wife of a most noble, honoured lord, estimable as a man, exemplary and affectionate as a husband, and the fond father of her only child, but she, notwithstanding all this, striking her heart, dares to say to it, "But thou art Bertram still, and Bertram's ever." A monk now enters, and entreats in his prior's name for the wonted hospitality and free noble usage of the castle of St. Aldobrand for some wretched shipwrecked souls, and from this we learn, for the first time, to our infinite surprise, that notwithstanding the supernaturalness of the storm aforesaid, not only Bertram, but the whole of his gang had been saved, by what means we are left to conjecture, and can only conclude that they had all the same desperate swimming powers, and the same saving destiny as the hero, Bertram himself. So ends the first act, and with it the tale of the events, both those with which the tragedy begins, and those which had occurred previous to the date of its commencement. The second displays Bertram in disturbed sleep, which the prior, who hangs over him, prefers calling a starting trance, and with a strained voice, that would have awakened one of the 7 sleepers, observes to the audience, "How the lip works! How the bare teeth do grind, and beaded drops course down his writhen brow!" The dramatic effect of which passage we not only concede to the admirers of this tragedy, but acknowledge the further advantages of preparing the audience for the most surprising series of wry faces, proflated mouths, and lunatic gestures that were ever launched on an audience to sear the sense. Prior. I will awake him from this horrid trance. This is no natural sleep. Ho! Wake thee, stranger! This is rather a whimsical application of the verb reflex, we must confess, though we remember a similar transfer of the agent to the patient in a manuscript tragedy, in which the Bertram of the piece, prostrating a man with a single blow of his fist, exclaims, "Knock me thee down, then ask thee if thou livest." Well, the stranger obeys, and whatever his sleep might have been, his waking was perfectly natural, for the lethargy itself could not withstand the scolding stentorship of Mr. Holland, the prior. We next learn from the best authority, his own confession, that the misanthropic hero, whose destiny was incompatible with drowning, is Count Bertram, who not only reveals his past fortunes, but avows with open atrocity his satanic hatred of Imogen's lord, and his frantic thirst of revenge. And so the raving character raves, and the scolding character scolds, and what else? Does not the prior act? Does he not send for a posse of constables or thief-takers to handcuff the villain, or take him either to Bedlam or Newgate? Nothing of the kind. The author preserves the unity of character, and the scolding prior from first to last does nothing but scold, with the exception indeed of the last scene of the last act, in which, with a most surprising revolution, he whines, weeps, and kneels to the condemned blaspheming assassin, out of pure affection to the high-hearted man, the sublimity of whose angel sin rivals the star-bright apostate, that is, who was as proud as Lucifer and as wicked as the devil, and had thrilled him, prior Holland aforesaid, with wild admiration. Accordingly, in the very next scene, we have this tragic Macheath with his whole gang in the castle of St. Aldobrand, without any attempt on the prior's part either to prevent him, or to put the mistress and servants of the castle on their guard against their new inmates, though he, the prior, knew, and confesses that he knew, that Bertram's fearful mates were assassins so habituated and naturalized to guilt that, when their drenched hold forsook both gold and gear, they gripped their daggers with a murderous instinct. And though he also knew that Bertram was the leader of a band whose trade was blood. To the castle, however, he goes, thus with the holy prior's consent, if not with his assistance, and thither let us follow him. No sooner is our hero safely housed in the castle of St. Aldobrand, than he attracts the notice of the lady and her confidant by his wild and terrible dark eyes, muffled form, fearful form, darkly wild, proudly stern, and the like commonplace indefinites, seasoned by merely verbal antitheses, and at best copied with very slight change from the Conrad or Southey's Joan of Arc. The Lady Imogen, who has been, as is the case, she tells us, with all soft and solemn spirits, worshipping the moon on a terrace or rampart within view of the castle, insists on having an interview with our hero, and this too tete-a-tete. Would the reader learn why and wherefore the confidant is excluded, who very properly remonstrates against such conference alone at night with one who bears such fearful form, the reason follows. Why, therefore send him. I say follows, because the next line, all things of fear have lost their power over me, is separated from the former by a break or pause. And besides that it is a very poor answer to the danger, is no answer at all to the gross indelicacy of this wilful exposure. We must therefore regard it as a mere afterthought, that a little softens the rudeness, but adds nothing to the weight of that exquisite woman's reason aforesaid. And so exit Clotilda, and enter Bertram, who stands without looking at her, that is, with his lower limbs forked, his arms akimbo, his side to the lady's front, the whole figure resembling an inverted Y. He is soon, however, roused from the state surly to the state frantic, and then follow raving, yelling, cursing, she fainting, he relenting, in runs Imogen's child, squeaks, "Mother!" He snatches it up, and with a "God bless thee, child! Bertram has kissed thy child," the curtain drops. The third act is short, and short be our account of it. It introduces Lord St. Aldobrand on his road homeward, and next Imogen in the convent, confessing the foulness of her heart to the prior, who first indulges his old humour with a fit of senseless scolding, then leaves her alone with her ruffian paramour, with whom she makes at once an infamous appointment, and the curtain drops, that it may be carried into act and consummation. I want words to describe the mingled horror and disgust with which I witnessed the opening of the fourth act, considering it as a melancholy proof of the depravation of the public mind. The shocking spirit of Jacobinism seemed no longer confined to politics. The familiarity with atrocious events and characters appeared to have poisoned the taste, even where it had not directly disorganized the moral principles, and left the feelings callous to all the mild appeals, and craving alone for the grossest and most outrageous stimulants. The very fact, then present to our senses, that a British audience could remain passive under such an insult to common decency, nay, receive with a thunder of applause a human being supposed to have come reeking from the consummation of this complex foulness and baseness, these and the like reflections so pressed as with the weight of lead upon my heart, that actor, author, and tragedy would have been forgotten, had it not been for a plain elderly man sitting beside me, who with a very serious face, that at once expressed surprise and aversion, touched my elbow, and pointing to the actor, said to me in a half whisper, "Do you see that little fellow there? He's just been committing adultery." Somewhat relieved by the laugh which this droll address occasioned, I forced back my attention to the stage sufficiently to learn that Bertram is recovered from a transient fit of remorse by the information that St. Aldobrand was commissioned to do what every honest man must have done without commission, if he did his duty, to seize him and deliver him to the just vengeance of the law. An information which, as he had long known himself to be an attainted traitor and proclaimed outlaw, and not only a trader in blood himself, but notoriously the captain of a gang of thieves, pirates, and assassins, assuredly could not have been new to him. It is this, however, which alone and instantly restores him to his accustomed state of raving, blasphemy, and nonsense. Next follows Imogen's constrained interview with her injured husband, and his sudden departure again, all in love and kindness, in order to attend the feast of St. Anselm at the convent. This was, it must be owned, a very strange engagement for so tender a husband to make within a few minutes, after so long an absence. But first his lady has told him that she has a vow on her, and wishes that black perdition may gulf her perjured soul. Note, she is lying at the very time, if she ascends his bed, till her penance is accomplished. How therefore is the poor husband to amuse himself in this interval of her penance? But do not be distressed, reader, on account of the St. Aldobrand's absence. As the author has contrived to send him out of the house, when a husband would be in his and the lover's way, so he will doubtless not be at a loss to bring him back again, as soon as he is wanted. Well, the husband gone in on the one side, out pops the lover from the other, and for the fiendish purpose of harrowing up the soul of his wretched accomplice in guilt, by announcing to her with most brutal and blasphemous execrations his fixed and deliberate resolve to assassinate her husband, all this, too, is for no discoverable purpose on the part of the author, but that of introducing a series of super-tragic starts, pauses, screams, struggling, dagger-throwing, falling on the ground, starting up again wildly, swearing, outcries for help, falling again on the ground, rising again, faintly tottering towards the door, and, to end the scene, a most convenient fainting fit of Our Lady's, just in time to give Bertram an opportunity of seeking the object of his hatred before she alarms the house, which indeed she has had full time to have done before, but that the author rather chose she should amuse herself and the audience by the above described ravings and startings. She recovers slowly, and to her enter Clotilda, the confidante and mother confessor, then commences what in theatrical language is called the madness, but which the author more accurately entitles delirium. It appearing indeed a sort of intermittent fever with fits of light-headedness off and on, whenever occasion and stage effect happen to call for it. A convenient return of the storm, we told the reader beforehand how it would be, had changed the rivulet that bathed the convent walls into a foaming flood. Upon its brink the Lord and his small train do stand appalled. With torch and bell from their high battlements, the monks do summon to the pass in vain. He must return to-night. Talk of the devil and his horns appear, says the proverb, and sure enough, within 10 lines of the exit of the messenger sent to stop him, the arrival of Lord St. Aldobrand is announced. Bertram's ruffian band now enter, and range themselves across the stage, giving fresh cause for Imogen's screams and madness. St. Aldobrand, having received his mortal wound behind the scenes, totters in to welter in his blood, and to die at the feet of this double-damned adulteress. Of her, as far as she is concerned in this 4th act, we have 2 additional points to notice. First, the low cunning and Jesuitical trick with which she deludes her husband into words of forgiveness, which he himself does not understand; and secondly, that everywhere she is made the object of interest and sympathy, and it is not the author's fault if, at any moment, she excites feelings less gentle than those we are accustomed to associate with the self-accusations of a sincere religious penitent. And did a British audience endure all this? They received it with plaudits, which, but for the rivalry of the carts and hackney coaches, might have disturbed the evening prayers of the scanty week-day congregation at St. Paul's Cathedral. Tempora mutantur, nos et mutamur in illis. Of the 5th act, the only thing noticeable, for rant and nonsense, though abundant as ever, have long before the last act become things of course, is the profane representation of the high altar in a chapel, with all the vessels and other preparations for the Holy Sacrament. A hymn is actually sung on the stage by the chorister boys. For the rest, Imogen, who now and then talks deliriously, but who is always light-headed, as far as her gown and hair can make her so, wanders about in dark woods with cavern rocks and precipices in the back scene, and a number of mute dramatis personae move in and out continually, for whose presence there is always at least this reason, that they afford something to be seen, by that very large part of a Drury Lane audience who have small chance of hearing a word. She had, it appears, taken her child with her, but what becomes of the child, whether she murdered it or not, nobody can tell, nobody can learn. It was a riddle at the representation, and after a most attentive perusal of the play, a riddle it remains. No more I know, I wish I did, and I would tell it all to you, for what became of this poor child, there's none that ever knew. Our whole information is derived from the following words. Prior. Where is thy child? Clotilde, pointing to the cavern into which she has looked. Oh, he lies cold within his cavern tomb. Why dost thou urge her with the horrid theme? Prior, who will not, the reader may observe, be disappointed of his dose of scolding. It was to make (query, wake) one living chord o' the heart, and I will try, though my own breaks at it. Where is thy child? Imogen, with a frantic laugh. The forest fiend hath snatched him. He who, the fiend or the child? Rides the nightmare through the wizard woods. Now these 2 lines consist in a senseless plagiarism from the counterfeited madness of Edgar in Lear, who, in imitation of the gypsy incantations, puns on the old word mare, a hag, and the no less senseless adoption of Dryden's forest fiend, and the wizard stream by which Milton in his Lycidas so finely characterizes the spreading diva, fabulosus amnis. Observe, too, these images stand unique in the speeches of Imogen, without the slightest resemblance to anything she says before or after. But we are weary. The characters in this act frisk about, here, there, and everywhere, as teasingly as the jack-o'-lantern lights which mischievous boys, from across a narrow street, throw with a looking-glass on the faces of their opposite neighbours. Bertram, disarmed, out-Heroding Charles de Moor in the Robbers, befaces the collected Knights of St. Anselm, all in complete armour, and so, by pure dint of black looks, he outdares them into passive poltroons. The sudden revolution in the prior's manners we have before noticed, and it is indeed so outré, that a number of the audience imagined a great secret was to come out, viz. That the prior was one of the many instances of a youthful sinner metamorphosed into an old scold, and that this Bertram would appear at last to be his son. Imogen reappears at the convent, and dies of her own accord. Bertram stabs himself, and dies by her side, and that the play may conclude as it began, to wit, in a superfetation of blasphemy upon nonsense, because he had snatched a sword from a despicable coward, who retreats in terror when it is pointed towards him in sport. This fellow de se and thief captain, this loathsome and leprous confluence of robbery, adultery, murder, and cowardly assassination, this monster, whose best deed is the having saved his betters from the degradation of hanging him by turning Jack Ketch to himself, first recommends the charitable monks and holy prior to pray for his soul, and then has the folly and impudence to exclaim, "I die no felon's death! A warrior's weapon freed, a warrior's soul." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Biographia Literaria. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. Biographia Literaria by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Chapter 24. Conclusion. It sometimes happens that we are punished for our faults by incidents, in the causation of which these faults had no share. And this I have always felt the severest punishment. The wound, indeed, is of the same dimensions, but the edges are jagged, and there is a dull underpain that survives the smart which it had aggravated. For there is always a consolatory feeling that accompanies the sense of a proportion between antecedents and consequents. The sense of before and after becomes both intelligible and intellectual when, and only when, we contemplate the succession in the relations of cause and effect, which, like the two poles of the magnet, manifest the being and unity of the one power by relative opposites, and give, as it were, a substratum of permanence, of identity, and therefore of reality, to the shadowy flux of time. It is eternity revealing itself in the phenomena of time, and the perception and acknowledgement of the proportionality and appropriateness of the present to the past prove to the afflicted soul that it has not yet been deprived of the sight of God, that it can still recognize the effective presence of a Father, though through a darkened glass and a turbid atmosphere, though of a Father that is chastising it. And for this cause, doubtless, are we so framed in mind, and even so organized in brain and nerve, that all confusion is painful. It is within the experience of many medical practitioners, that a patient with strange and unusual symptoms of disease has been more distressed in mind, more wretched from the fact of being unintelligible to himself and others, than from the pain or danger of the disease. Nay, that the patient has received the most solid comfort, and resumed a genial and enduring cheerfulness from some new symptom or product that had at once determined the name and nature of his complaint, and rendered it an intelligible effect of an intelligible cause, even though the discovery did at the same moment preclude all hope of restoration. Hence the mystic theologians, whose delusions we may more confidently hope to separate from their actual intuitions, when we condescend to read their works without the presumption that whatever our fancy, always the ape, and too often the adulterator and counterfeit of our memory, has not made or cannot make a picture of, must be nonsense. Hence, I say, the mystics have joined in representing the state of the reprobate spirits as a dreadful dream in which there is no sense of reality, not even of the pangs they are enduring, an eternity without time, and as it were below it, God present without manifestation of his presence. But these are depths which we dare not linger over. Let us turn to an instance more on a level with the ordinary sympathies of mankind. Here then, and in this same healing influence of light and distinct beholding, we may detect the final cause of that instinct which, in the great majority of instances, leads and almost compels the afflicted to communicate their sorrows. Hence too flows the alleviation that results from opening out our griefs, which are thus presented in distinguishable forms, instead of the mist, through which whatever is shapeless becomes magnified and literally enormous. Casimir, in the 5th Ode of his 3rd book, has happily expressed this thought: Me longa silendi edit amor, facilesque luctus, hausit medullas, fugerit ocius, simul negantem vis regiusuris, aures amicorum, et loquacem questibus evacuaris iram. Olim querendo desinimus queri, ipsoque fletu lacrima perditur, nec fortis aeque, si per omnes, cura volat residetque ramos. Vires amices perdit in auribus, minorque semper dividitur dolor, per multa permissus vagari pectora. I shall not make this an excuse, however, for troubling my readers with any complaints or explanations, with which, as readers, they have little or no concern. It may suffice, for the present at least, to declare, that the causes that have delayed the publication of these volumes for so long a period after they had been printed off, were not connected with any neglect of my own, and that they would form an instructive comment on the character concerning authorship as a trade, addressed to young men of genius in the first volume of this work. I remember the ludicrous effect produced on my mind by the fast sentence of an autobiography, which, happily for the writer, was as meagre in incidents as it is well possible for the life of an individual to be. The eventful life which I am about to record, from the hour in which I rose into existence on this planet, etc. Yet when, notwithstanding this warning example of importance before me, I review my own life, I cannot refrain from applying the same epithet to it, and with more than ordinary emphasis. And no private feeling, that affected myself only, should prevent me from publishing the same, for write it I assuredly shall, should life and leisure be granted me. If continued reflection should strengthen my present belief, that my history would add its contingent to the enforcement of one important truth, to wit, that we must not only love our neighbours as ourselves, but ourselves likewise as our neighbours, and that we can do neither unless we love God above both. Who lives, that's not depraved or depraves? Who dies, that bears not one spurn to the grave of their friend's gift? Strange as the delusion may appear, yet it is most true, that 3 years ago I did not know or believe that I had an enemy in the world, and now even my strongest sensations of gratitude are mingled with fear, and I reproach myself for being too often disposed to ask, have I one friend? During the many years which intervened between the composition and the publication of the Christabel, it became almost as well known among literary men as if it had been on common sale. The same references were made to it, and the same liberties taken with it, even to the very names of the imaginary persons in the poem. From almost all of our most celebrated poets, and from some with whom I had no personal acquaintance, I either received or heard of expressions of admiration that, I can truly say, appeared to myself utterly disproportionate to a work that pretended to be nothing more than a common fairy tale. Many, who had allowed no merit to my other poems, whether printed or manuscript, and who have frankly told me as much, uniformly made an exception in favour of the Christabel and the poem entitled Love. Year after year, and in societies of the most different kinds, I had been entreated to recite it, and the result was still the same in all, and altogether different in this respect from the effect produced by the occasional recitation of any other poems I had composed. This before the publication, and since then, with very few exceptions, I have heard nothing but abuse, and this too in a spirit of bitterness at least as disproportionate to the pretensions of the poem, had it been the most pitiably below mediocrity, as the previous eulogies, and far more inexplicable. This may serve as a warning to authors, that in their calculations on the probable reception of a poem, they must subtract to a large amount from the panegyric, which may have encouraged them to publish it, however unsuspicious and however various the sources of this panegyric may have been. And first, allowances must be made for private enmity, of the very existence of which they had perhaps entertained no suspicion, for personal enmity behind the mask of anonymous criticism. Secondly, for the necessity of a certain proportion of abuse and ridicule in a review, in order to make it saleable, in consequence of which, if they have no friends behind the scenes, the chance must needs be against them. But lastly and chiefly, for the excitement and temporary sympathy of feeling, which the recitation of the poem by an admirer, especially if he be at once a warm admirer and a man of acknowledged celebrity, calls forth in the audience. For this is really a species of animal magnetism, in which the enkindling reciter, by perpetual comment of looks and tones, lends his own will and apprehensive faculty to his auditors. They live for the time within the dilated sphere of his intellectual being. It is equally possible, though not equally common, that a reader left to himself should sink below the poem, as that the poem left to itself should flag beneath the feelings of the reader. But in my own instance I had the additional misfortune of having been gossiped about, as devoted to metaphysics, and worse than all, to a system incomparably nearer to the visionary flights of Plato, and even to the jargon of the mystics, than to the established tenets of Locke. Whatever therefore appeared with my name was condemned beforehand as predestined metaphysics. In a dramatic poem, which had been submitted by me to a gentleman of great influence in the theatrical world, occurred the following passage: "Oh, we are querulous creatures! Little less than all things can suffice to make us happy, and little more than nothing is enough to make us wretched." "Ay, here now," exclaimed the critic, "here come Coleridge's metaphysics." And the very same motive, that is, not that the lines were unfit for the present state of our immense theatres, but that they were metaphysics, was assigned elsewhere for the rejection of the two following passages. The first is spoken in answer to a usurper who had rested his plea on the circumstance that he had been chosen by the acclamations of the people. What people? How convened? Or if convened, must not the magic power that charms together millions of men in council needs have power to win or wield them? Rather, oh far rather, shout forth thy titles to your encircling mountains, and with a thousandfold reverberation make the rocks flatter thee, and the volleying air, unbribed, shout back to thee, King Emmerich! By wholesome laws to embank the sovereign power, to deepen by restraint and by prevention of lawless will, to amass and guide the flood in its majestic channel, is man's task, and the true patriot's glory. In all else, men safelier trust to heaven, than to themselves when least themselves, even in those whirling crowds where folly is contagious, and too oft even wise men leave their better sense at home, to chide and wonder at them when returned. The second passage is in the mouth of an old and experienced courtier, betrayed by the man in whom he had most trusted. And yet Sir Walter, simple, inexperienced, could see him as he was, and often warned me. Whence learned she this? Oh, she was innocent. And to be innocent is nature's wisdom. The fledged dove knows the prowlers of the air, feared soon as seen, and flutters back to shelter, and the young steed recoils upon his haunches, the never yet seen adder's hiss first heard. Oh, surer than suspicion's 100 eyes is that fine sense, which to the pure in heart, by mere oppugnancy of their own goodness, reveals the approach of evil. As therefore my character as a writer could not easily be more injured by an overt act than it was already in consequence of the report, I published a work, a large portion of which was professedly metaphysical. A long delay occurred between its first annunciation and its appearance. It was reviewed therefore by anticipation with a malignity so avowedly and exclusively personal as is, I believe, unprecedented even in the present contempt of all common humanity that disgraces and endangers the liberty of the press. After its appearance, the author of this lampoon undertook to review it in the Edinburgh Review, and under the single condition, that he should have written what he himself really thought, and have criticised the work as he would have done had its author been indifferent to him, I should have chosen that man myself, both from the vigour and the originality of his mind, and from his particular acuteness in speculative reasoning before all others. I remember Catullus's lines: Desine de quoquam quicquam bene velle mereri, aut aliquam fieri posse putare pium. Omnia sunt ingrata, nihil fecisse benigne est, immo etiam taedet obesque magis. Ud mihi quem nemo gravius nec acerbius urget, quam modo qui me unum atque unicum amicum habuit. But I can truly say, that the grief with which I read this rhapsody of predetermined insult had the rhapsodist himself for its whole and sole object. I refer to this review at present, in consequence of information having been given me, that the innuendo of my potential infidelity, grounded on one passage of my first lay sermon, has been received and propagated with a degree of credence, of which I can safely acquit the originator of the calumny. I give the sentences as they stand in the sermon, premising only that I was speaking exclusively of miracles worked for the outward senses of men. It was only to overthrow the usurpation exercised in and through the senses, that the senses were miraculously appealed to. Reason and religion are their own evidence. The natural sun is in this respect a symbol of the spiritual. Ere he is fully arisen, and while his glories are still under veil, he calls up the breeze to chase away the usurping vapours of the night season, and thus converts the air itself into the minister of its own purification, not surely in proof or elucidation of the light from heaven, but to prevent its interception. Wherever, therefore, similar circumstances coexist with the same moral causes, the principles revealed and the examples recorded in the inspired writings render miracles superfluous, And if we neglect to apply truths in expectation of wonders, or under pretext of the cessation of the latter, we tempt God, and merit the same reply which our Lord gave to the Pharisees on a like occasion. In the Sermon and the Notes, both the historical truth and the necessity of the miracles are strongly and frequently asserted. The testimony of books of history, that is, relatively to the signs and wonders with which Christ came, is one of the strong and stately pillars of the Church, but it is not the foundation. Instead, therefore, of defending myself, which I could easily effect by a series of passages expressing the same opinion, from the fathers and the most eminent Protestant divines, from the Reformation to the Revolution, I shall merely state what my belief is concerning the true evidences of Christianity. 1. Its consistency with right reason, I consider as the outer court of the temple, the common area within which it stands. 2. The miracles, with and through which the religion was first revealed and attested, I regard as the steps, the vestibule, and the portal of the temple. 3. The sense, the inward feeling, in the soul of each believer of its exceeding desirableness, the experience that he needs something, joined with the strong foretokening that the redemption and the graces propounded to us in Christ are what he needs, this I hold to be the true foundation of the spiritual edifice. With the strong a priori probability that flows in from 1 and 3, on the correspondent historical evidence of 2, no man can refuse or neglect to make the experiment without guilt. But 4. It is the experience derived from a practical conformity to the conditions of the gospel. It is the opening eye, the dawning light, the terrors and the promises of spiritual growth, the blessedness of loving God as God, the nascent sense of sin, hated as sin, and of the incapability of attaining to either without Christ. It is the sorrow that still rises up from beneath, and the consolation that meets it from above, the bosom treacheries of the principal in the warfare, and the exceeding faithfulness and long-suffering of the uninteresting ally. In a word, it is the actual trial of the faith in Christ, with its accompaniments and results, that must form the arched roof, and the faith itself is the completing keystone. In order to an efficient belief in Christianity, a man must have been a Christian, and this is the seeming argumentum in circulo, incident to all spiritual truths, to every subject not presentable under the forms of time and space, as long as we attempt to master by the reflex acts of the understanding what we can only know by the act of becoming. Do the will of my Father, and ye shall know whether I am of God. These 4 evidences I believe to have been, and still to be, for the world, for the whole Church, all necessary, all equally necessary. But at present, and for the majority of Christians born in Christian countries, I believe the 3rd and the 4th evidences to be the most operative, not as superseding, but as involving a glad undoubting faith in the 2 former. Credidi, idioque intellexi, appears to me the dictate equally of philosophy and religion, even as I believe redemption to be the antecedent of sanctification, and not its consequent. All spiritual predicates may be construed indifferently as modes of action or as states of being. Thus holiness and blessedness are the same idea, now seen in relation to act and now to existence. The ready belief which has been yielded to the slander of my potential infidelity, I attribute in part to the openness with which I have avowed my doubts, whether the heavy interdict, under which the name of Benedict Spinoza lies, is merited on the whole or to the whole extent. Be this as it may, I wish, however, that I could find in the books of philosophy, theoretical or moral, which are alone recommended to the present students of theology in our established schools, a few passages as thoroughly Pauline, as completely accordant with the doctrines of the established Church, as the following sentences in the concluding page of Spinoza's Ethics. Deinde quo mens hoc amore divino, seu beatitudine magis gaudet, eo plus intelligit, hoc est, eo majorem in affectus habet potentiam, et eo minus ab affectibus, qui mali sunt patito, atque ad eo ex eo, quod mens hoc amore divino, seu beatitudine gaudet, potestatem habet libidines coascendi, et quia humana potentia ad coascendos affectus in solo intellectu consistit, ergo nemo beatitudine gaudet, quia affectus coercuit, sed contra potestas libidines coascendi ex ipsa beatitudine oritur. With regard to the Unitarians, it has been shamelessly asserted that I have denied them to be Christians. God forbid! For how should I know what the piety of the heart may be, or what quantum of error in the understanding may consist with a saving faith in the intentions and actual dispositions of the whole moral being in any one individual? Never will God reject a soul that sincerely loves him, be his speculative opinions what they may. And whether in any given instance certain opinions, be they unbelief or misbelief, are compatible with a sincere love of God, God can only know. But this I have said, and shall continue to say, that if the doctrines, the sum of which I believe to constitute the truth in Christ, be Christianity, then Unitarianism is not, and vice versa; and that in speaking theologically and impersonally, i.e. of Philanthropism and Theanthropism, as schemes of belief, without reference to individuals who profess either the one or the other, it would be absurd to use a different language as long as it is the dictate of common sense, that two opposites cannot properly be called by the same name. I should feel no offence if a Unitarian applied the same to me, any more than if he were to say that 2 and 2 being 4, 4 and 4 must be 8. Alla broton ton men, keneophrones aukai, ex agathon ibalon, ton dau katamemphthent agan, iskun okeon parasphalен kalon, kairos elkon apiso, thumas atalmos eon. This has been my object, and this alone can be my defence. And oh, that with this, my personal, as well as my literary life, might conclude. The unquenched desire, I mean, not without the consciousness of having earnestly endeavoured to kindle young minds, and to guard them against the temptations of scorners, by showing that the scheme of Christianity, as taught in the liturgy and homilies of our Church, though not discoverable by human reason, is yet in accordance with it; that link follows link by necessary consequence; that religion passes out of the ken of reason, only where the eye of reason has reached its own horizon; and that faith is then but its continuation. Even as the day softens away into the sweet twilight, and twilight hushed and breathless steals into the darkness. It is night, sacred night. The upraised eye views only the starry heaven, which manifests itself alone; and the outward beholding is fixed on the sparks twinkling in the awful depth, those suns of other worlds, only to preserve the soul steady and collected in its pure act of inward adoration to the great I Am, and to the filial word that reaffirmeth it from eternity to eternity, whose choral echo is the universe. Theo, Mono, Doxa. End of chapter 24. End of Biographia Literaria.